hard to keep up with all this literature. You want to make sure that you stay up to date with the field, because this is how scientists share their communications with other people. But these articles can be like really dense and can take like hours to read thoroughly. So what you want to do is you need to have like a strategy going into a paper reading. So today I want to just kind of help provide some guidance on how to approach reading these articles. The main piece of advice I want to give is actually one that you probably don't want to hear, and that's that reading articles can be hard, even for doctors. And really the best way to get good at reading articles is to read a lot of articles. And so since I defended my thesis, I've had a little more downtime while I'm waiting on some paper edits to really catch up on reading some articles. And really it's just like a matter of practicing reading to get really good at it. But even what good at it is going to depend on like having a purpose when you go into reading it, like what you want to get out of reading it. And so that's the second piece of advice, is really to go in there with the mindset of what you're hoping to get out of the paper. And so if it's something that's like really close to your research and it could like greatly impact your own research, you're probably going to want to take a lot closer of a reading. And you're also going to want to take a close reading if it's for like presenting it in some sort of journal club, or if you're in school and you have like a journal club that you need to go and you're going to go and discuss this article, such as, and especially if there's like with professors and that sort of thing. So you want to make sure you do a thorough reading. For other purposes, you might be maybe going to really just look at a specific section. So maybe you want to see the introduction to see where the field was at the time that the person did the article, or maybe get some guidance into what review articles you should be going to look for. Other times you might want to you're going to look for the methods section because you want to see how they did it in an experiment. And sometimes you're just reading for fun. So it's something outside of your field maybe, and you know that you're not going to be able to understand every little detail, but you want to kind of get the overall idea of the article. And so it's really important to have some sort of purpose going into it, I think, because otherwise you just end up kind of like scrolling through titles of articles on this site, kind of like when you're looking through Netflix and you're not really sure what you want to watch and nothing really sounds good. And then you put a bunch of stuff in your list and then you go through your list and you're like, I don't really want to read this. So you don't want to have that sort of feeling. So you instead want to have like a purposeful, like, yeah, I want to read this article because, and hopefully it's not just because you have to for a class, but in that case, then the thing is just like try to get the most out of it possible. But for other purposes, you want to really just have the idea of what you're hoping to get out of a paper, and that helps you kind of approach it and budget your time, because if you try to take it, like if you try to go deep dive into every little thing, which is important to do for some things, like if the paper is fundamental to setting the foundations for your own research, or it could directly influence how you're thinking about your research, you don't want to carefully read it and not just accept as fact the conclusions that they state. And you'll really want to look into everything really closely. But that can take hours, like literally hours. And so if you were to do that for every single paper, like this is just like a week or a month, I don't know how they do these. But look at all that stuff. And so not all of it is going to be as like important for you. Like you never know where you're going to get ideas from, and it can be really fun and also really helpful for your own research and for your own mindset to read articles from outside of your field. But if you were to take like the time to in-depth read every single article, it would take more hours than there are in a day. And so my goal with this post is kind of just give you an idea of what to expect when you're reading a science article and kind of how to approach it. And so the third big piece of advice is that everybody kind of has their own styles and their own things that work for them. And so I can't tell you what will work for you. I can just give you advice about what's been helpful for me and what I've found beneficial when reading science articles. So I'll get into more details on papers and finding papers and reading papers and the different aspects of papers and all sorts of stuff about papers in a minute. But this is kind of like a key takeaway that I want to give people before they drop out from the video if they're not interested in more details. So basically I'll be talking more about things to do while you're reading the article, but it's also important to, after you read the article, kind of take a few minutes to really consolidate your thinking about the article and take notes so that in the future, it's not just another article that, oh yeah, I think I read something about that a few years ago. There was this paper here and I don't really remember. So what I like to do is I like to take digital notes. In my lab notebooks, I use OneNote. I have like tabs for, like a tab for papers. And I will do like summaries of the paper. So I like doing it in this digital format because it is then searchable and linkable. So I have the links to the articles as well as the citation info. And I also have added these papers to my reference manager. So I use Mendeley, another one, Zotero. So I've talked about this before and I can link to the link on that post. But so you want to have this kind of summary of your thinking about the article. And I remember in like school when teachers would make you do like take a few minutes at the end of a class or like after reading or something to like reflect on the things and really consolidate your thinking before moving on to the next class. I could sometimes would get a little annoyed. I'm like, yeah, I'm all good. But really then I found it really helpful, especially looking back when you're trying to like study for meetings or whatever. And then you have this kind of like summary of what you were thinking at the time, because there's so much stuff going on in your head, like you're just going to forget stuff. And so having that, like that's what I put in here. Like, so I start by writing like a couple sentences summarizing the key findings and your impression. So don't just copy and paste the abstract. So the abstract's like kind of like the summary that they give you. You want to give a summary of what you took away from the article. What was your impression of it? How does it like impact you or your work potentially? So really it's about your reading of the article, not just the article itself. Like we talk about science a lot as being really empirical. So like fact and evidence based, and but a lot of it really is, I mean, people do science, people read science, scientists are people, doctors are people, we're all people. People have impressions, opinions, all of this sort of thing. And as long as they're based in fact, then we can like, it's just important to take into account that your mindset really is important, and it does influence how you'll think about things. And so the more you do science, the more knowledge you'll have in the toolbox, and the more your impression will really be kind of like sculpted and better, like scientific-y. I don't know. I hope that this makes sense to some people what I'm saying. If not, just ignore it, as always with my ramblings. Okay, so after that couple like sentence summary, and try to just keep that to a couple sentences, because it is a really hard skill in science, as you probably noticed from me rambling a lot, is that it can be really hard to be concise and to really consolidate the core essence of something. So try to consolidate it just in those initial couple sentences, and then you can detail more things in your bullet notes. So I'd like to take bullets on what type of experiments did they use. So did they use a structural biology technique like X-ray crystallography or cryo-EM? If so, you want to put it in the PDB codes so you can access the structures, and more on the PDB in another post, but that's just like where you can then go and look at the actual 3D models that they made. Did they use Western blots? Did they use mass spectrometry? So all these various techniques. Just briefly, like what techniques did they use?
how strong was the evidence? So the authors are going to give you, like in their abstract and in their conclusions and all this stuff, they're going to give you their interpretation of their findings. And they are going to, I mean, those will have to, as long as it's going through like a peer review process. So there's other people like the journal editors and stuff, making sure that you're not making like, that the evidence really does back up their claims. But you might not think that the evidence is strong as the authors think that their evidence is. So you want to put in like, how strong was this evidence? And this will often vary for various claims. So some of the claims that the authors in the paper make might be really, really well supported by their evidence, whereas other claims might have more weaker evidence. So make note of that. Make note of what experiments were like, what their experiments clearly showed, what their experiments might have shown, that sort of thing. Especially if it is something that maybe conflicts with findings from other labs or other papers, you want to take a really close look at that. And not that the findings are wrong if they conflict with other findings, but maybe try to figure out like what's different, like were they using different cell line, different isoform of a protein, that sort of thing. So really just think critically about the strength of the evidence and the claims. Then when applicable, and this is really important when it's applicable, how does it potentially fit into your research? So when you're just starting out, this might not really be applicable to you, or it's not applicable probably if you're like a biologist reading a space paper. I'm not saying you shouldn't be reading those space papers, because that's really, it's helping you get that broader scientific mindset and that sort of thing. It can give you like out of this world ideas. But when something is like in your field, like they're working with the same proteins that you are, maybe the same sort of concepts, you want to really make note of how this could potentially fit into your research. So sometimes instead of focusing on what the authors and most people probably focus on, that part of the paper, maybe you're focused on one little like nitty-gritty experiment, because it could potentially be really important for how you're interpreting your own findings. So one of the things with science is that when you're finding, like you have this knowledge that other people don't, especially when like, so if you're doing your own like research, like at the bench type of stuff, or computational people like crunching away with the numbers, you have like knowledge before other people. And sometimes I really hate that, because it's like, I just want to tell people about my research, but then there's all this like confidentiality stuff, because it's like you don't want to get scooped, like have other people still get like publish it first or whatever, and it's this whole don't get me started. But anyway, so you have this like view like, oh, this could fit into what I'm doing in this way or whatever, and so you want to take note of those sort of things and those sort of thoughts. So you could go back and add to these notes later. So it's like, I like to do this right after you read the paper, well, it's fresh in your mind. But then it's important that you kind of reflect back on this. So the part of the purpose of having, it's not just to consolidate your thoughts, but it's to really have it so that you can look back on it. And so that's why part of the reason why I like it in this doing it in a digital format. So then I can search for the various things and find them more easily. And then I also have, because I keep them all in like the same place, then I can kind of like look around and see how this like correlates to this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Yeah. So what was I saying? Yeah, so you want to take more detailed notes on the things that might be more applicable to you, and then like go back as your research evolves, and or even just as you evolve as a scientist. Maybe you read the article again. So maybe you read it in like your first year of grad school, and then you read it again in like your fourth year, and bam, wow, it makes a lot more sense. And so I found that a lot when I was rereading papers when preparing my thesis, which is like this big summary of all the work that you've done over in the course of earning your doctorate. And So it involves a lot of paper reading, but like for those papers, I was reading stuff a lot of the time. It was papers that I had read a lot of times before because they were really relevant to my work, but I was getting a lot more out of them, especially because when I had it like directly impacted my research, and I had done similar experiments, or I had ideas about why they might have found a finding that they wouldn't have been able to interpret, and that sort of thing, based on the knowledge that I gained over the course of doing my own research. And so basically it's important to have this notes, and then you can like go back to these notes. So when I said to keep it like concise, that's just for like the summarizing part. I mean, you don't want to go like too detailed in anything, but you can take more detailed notes on the things that are really important. So maybe maybe you really, if you want to write down the exact reaction conditions that they use, because maybe you're going to try to recreate the experiment or that sort of thing. So take more detailed notes on the things that you think are most important, especially in the context of what's most important for you as a scientist. And so this is just, I like to do this, and I like to do it in like a digital notebook as opposed to just like a Word document or something. Just personally, I like being able to like move things around so I can like kind of see how different articles connect and that sort of thing, and really add. And yeah, but it's totally whatever format works best for you. And maybe you do want to use paper. And as long as you have some organizational strategy, go for what works for you. And so I know a lot of people like to take notes when they're reading articles. And this is really important too. But I think it's important too to take notes after you read. As opposed, like a lot of times what I'll do is I'll kind of like, if I'm reading a paper, I'll sometimes, especially if I'm doing it on like a paper version, I'll take like scribble like notes along the way. I do that a lot if I'm reading a paper for like a journal club or that sort of thing. Then I like to be able to write notes in the margins and that sort of thing. But be careful with highlighting, because you might end up highlighting like the entire paper and then it's not helpful at all. But if you, then you just have all these scribbled notes all over the place. And I like having it in this like concise version that you can have searchable. The other thing about like digital, so I know a lot of people like to read hard copies and stuff and being able to write on them. And so, yeah, I like doing that sometimes. But these days, in addition to just like environmental friendliness, having the articles online, the important thing is, or not, even if not online, but in like an interactive PDF or something, is that the links are like you can click on like the references and they'll actually take you to the reference. But be careful when you do that, because sometimes they'll take you to like a different page. Like instead of like opening up a new browser page, they'll just like take you to a different page, like right when you're in the middle of an article, and then you have to go back, and then it's this whole thing. So either like open in it, like do like right click and open in another window, or sometimes they have like, if you click on it, it'll like pop up on the side of the screen with the reference list, or like in a hover over box. So you really just have to kind of become familiar with the various websites' ways of doing things, so you don't accidentally like lose your place in an article because you want to trying to find a reference. So that's a good thing about having it in the digital format, as well as you can then like, if you don't know what a word means, you can then like select the word and like dictionary or Google search it. And so that sort of thing can be really helpful. Okay, so now that we've kind of done this, like what to do after reading an article, let's go back and just talk really more about the articles themselves. So there are different types of scientific articles that you'll find in a journal. And each journal will call these like different things. They're these different things, and there'll be different formats and that sort of thing. But I'm going to show you in like the JBC, the Journal of Biological Chemistry, both because they have a lot of research that is like things relevant to me, and also because it's open access. So you see this like lock sign. This means that it's freely available for anyone to read. You don't need to have like a subscription or anything like that. So the various aspects, so often they'll have some sort of like editors pick highlights, or like news and views, or I don't remember all the various terms that people call them, but they're basically like summaries of articles, typically articles that are published somewhere else, somewhere in this journal, but sometimes they have these for articles that are published in other journals. They'll also often do them if there's a couple articles published on the same type of topic, even if it's like one article in this journal, one article in another journal, and try to like compare and contrast and summarize the findings. These can be a good thing to see whether you want to actually like go and read the paper in full. So if it's like in a paper that's important to you or your research in your field or whatever, you want to make sure that you read the original article and not just these people's interpretation of the article, because this is telling you these authors' interpretation of the other authors' findings. And you want to also make sure that that wouldn't be your interpretation of them. So with important things and that sort of thing, you want to actually go and look at the original article. But if it's something in like a different field or whatever, and you know that you're not going to be able to really understand fully the entire article, it can be really helpful to just like get a sense of what the authors found. And so I like doing those, reading those sometimes, as well as sometimes I like reading them after I read if I know I'm going to read the full article, sometimes I like reading these afterwards and then trying to kind of like see if I have the same conclusion. So I go into them with an open mind and not having these people's opinions kind of potentially shaping them. They're often also review articles. Review paper is where people kind of like summarize a various aspect of a field, and then like so summarize a bunch of other people's work and kind of like coalesce it all together. And review articles are great places to go if you are new to a field. So if you start reading, and sometimes like if you start reading an article and you're like, I have no idea what they're talking about, it can be helpful to try to find a review article. And often you can actually find those review articles by looking at what they're citing in the introduction. So we talked about review articles before. Those are where they kind of like sum up what's going on in the field, various aspects, that sort of thing. And so sometimes these articles are published, there's like full journals of reviews, just review article journals. But then there's often also, normally there's just like one or two review articles per like journal, like edition. But JBC is like a really big journal. So they have a ton of stuff. Then there's often like some sort of accelerated communications or notes or brief communications or matters arising, like, no, not matters arising. I think those are like, I don't know. But there's a bunch of short articles about just like kind of mini articles on recent findings. And then so the JBC, they list so next you have like the research articles. And so with the JBC, they have things like separated by topic. Most journals don't do that. Some do. But so they have a bunch of different topics and a ton of different articles. This is why I'm saying like you can't read every article like full out with everything. And this is just a single journal, a single edition of a single journal. But say I want to read this article. Okay, so I go to this article page. So the key things you'll find, let's look at this like the basic layout of an article. So you have the title, you have the author list. So the convention is typically that the first author, like the first person listed, is the person who did the most work on it, like was actually at the bench doing the work. So it's often like the PhD student or the postdoc, and then you have various people that did various things to help. Like maybe they did like one aspect of the project, like one set of the experiments, or that sort of thing. And then the last author is typically like the head of the lab, so like the PI, the principal investigator or the primary investigator. And so they're often also the corresponding author. So if you have a question or something about this paper, that's who you contact, and they have the contact information to send them. Then the DOI, so this is the direct digital object identifier. So this is the link that you will always be able to find this article at. Okay, so parts of a paper, they typically start with like an abstract or a summary. Sometimes it's a summary and an abstract, and that's basically summing up what they did, what they found, and the basic takeaway. And so this is kind of like, this is often how you kind of determine whether you want to actually read the full paper, but you don't want to just like take what they say as fact. But it's a good place to just kind of get a quick idea about what the paper is about. Keywords, abbreviations, and then you have your introduction. And so this is summing up where the field was when they started their research, like what was missing, and then like briefly like how their work contributes. But most of the discussion is actually going to be at the end in the separate discussion section. But it's nice that when they give you just like an idea of what to expect with the rest of the paper. Speaking of what to expect, so in like the results section, this is where they tell you about the experiments they did and what they found. And so this is where like all the figures are. Like a lot of times there'll be like supplemental figures. So it's like in a separate like supporting information document that you have to download separately. And they're often usually like less formatted and stuff. And sometimes that's where some of the best stuff is. But sometimes when I'm reading a paper, usually, even sometimes if I'm trying to decide whether I want to like fully read a paper, I'll scroll through the figures and to try to really get an idea of what type of experiments that they did, and whether it looks like something interesting. So yeah, so they have their results and they're not going into too much detail about like what they think it means. They save that part for discussion, and this is where they really are able to kind of bring all their findings together and tell you how they interpret them and what they think they mean in the context of the bigger field, and what's still missing, what are future directions for the research. Then you have the methods. So this is where you can get like falling into some rabbit holes, because sometimes when you have like, so they're saying like this was purified as described previously. And so then it takes you, thankfully this place, when they click on this, it just takes you to a little pop-up window to see the reference. I'm thankful this one's just 2019, but I don't know if I have access to that journal. So then if I want it, I have to like do a library loan request to try to get access to this journal. Sometimes it'll take you to an article that was like 50 years ago. Sometimes a lot of the times it'll take you to another article that says as described. Then so like this article will then take you to another article that says, like this article will say as described in, then you have to go to that article, and then yeah, be a very rabbit hole. But the methods section is super, super duper important, especially if you're going to try to reproduce an experiment. So as a PhD student, I know I did a lot of looking at method sections. And yeah, so they have different methods for the various things that they did. Sometimes most of the methods will actually be in like a supplemental methods. So yeah, so here it's called like supporting information. And so sometimes it'll have like experiments that the reviewers requested, additional detail and tables, various things. Sometimes it'll have like extended images like for the gels and stuff. If they like only showed you a portion of it, like a Western blot, then they'll show you like the full uncropped version. And sometimes you can find some kind of wacky things in there. Okay, then they have the references. Sometimes they'll put like there'll be like a note by a reference, like it'll be highlighted or something, and it'll be like of key importance, or that can be really helpful if you're trying to get an idea of what these what was happening beforehand, and what are key papers that this paper addresses in some sort of way. Sometimes different browsers will have like a separate like side window where you can actually see the figures while you're reading it. You often also be able to download the figures, like a PowerPoint of the figures, in case you want to then present them in like a journal club or that sort of thing. Another thing is that if you have access to an article and other people don't, sometimes you can actually like share a link that's available to anybody. Like this is open access to anyone, but sometimes you can do that. then this, so you'll see that because that was open access, you'll see like this open access symbol. And then if I click on it, it'll take me to a free version, but it's already free. But this open access plugin is this like Unpay Wall. Where's my? It's like this Unpay Wall. And so it's like this browser extension that I can then look and see whether or not there's a free version, and if there's a free version, then it'll take you to that. I also have a couple other paywalls. I'm not paywalls, a couple other extensions. I have PubPeer, which is gonna like tell you if a paper on the page has comments on PubPeer, which is like this site where people can make comments about articles, and usually they're like not good comments. So it's like people pointing out like this looks like this might be duplicated or that sort of thing. So it's helpful to have this extension to try to see if there are potential problems with the article that other people have pointed out. I also have this site extension, which will show you if an article's like where an article has been cited. And it's really helpful if you're trying to figure out like what came after this research. Like, you know, at the end of the paper, they have like future directions. But then you might want to know, well, did other people actually like follow up on the future directions? And like, so you want to see if people have cited the article, and then whether those people have like confirmed the findings, built upon the findings, disputed the findings. So that's a really helpful tool I like. One other thing, so with articles, so they typically, like the journal I was just showing you is like, those articles have gone through a peer review process. So basically how this works is the scientists write the paper draft, which we call a manuscript, and then they submit it to a journal. And then the editor takes a quick look and either rejects it outright or passes it along for peer review. And then with peer review, other scientists in the field give the paper a fine-comb reading and recommend either rejecting it, revising and resubmitting, which is the most common, which is where they ask you to do like additional experiments or clarify various things or take out a claim that was too strong, and then resubmit it or just publishing it as is. So this peer review process helps to weed out some sketchy articles and like if the evidence isn't good enough and that sort of thing. But it's not perfect. So you still need to read with the critical thinking cap on. Preprints, there's also those haven't got articles that haven't gone through peer review, but they're posted like sometimes, well, the article's also being submitted to the paper. But so this have not gone through peer review, but they can help get the results out quicker. One downside with them is that they're often, in addition to not being peer reviewed, so they can make claims that are unsubstantiated, but they're often also posted in like an unformatted PDF, and so you have to like open the things in different windows to try to like be able to look between the various things. But yeah, and so that's the basics about reading articles. And also, yeah, just you want to be using a reference manager, so I've put on that too. But I use Mendeley, and it has this like browser extension, so I can also like add the articles to my library while I'm on the paper with just like journals, like the article site. And then I can then use it if I want to cite it in my own writing and that sort of thing. And so I have posts on that too. Yeah, and I just remember to take notes afterwards and hope that happens.
One of the main things that I constantly have to tell myself is that reading these articles counts as work. And so if you're a PhD student and you're like, I feel like I should be like at the bench pipetting or whatever to be working, reading articles is a fundamental part of being a scientist, and it's a fundamental scientist, and it's a fundamental part of working. As the president of the IUBMB, Alexander Newton, constantly has to remind me that reading articles is work. It's part of your job. It's part you're absolutely entitled to spend time reading articles, especially if you're still making good progress in the lab and on all the fronts that you're supposed to be doing, because the articles are really where you get these ideas, where you see what's happening in the field, where you get ideas for new research. Like new experiments to try, see what other people are up to, all of that sort of thing. So papers, paper, paper.